Normandy, June 1944. The hedgerows were thick, their tangled walls of green hiding shadows and steel. Morning mist hung low over the fields, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. Down a narrow dirt road, a German Panzer IV crept forward, its treads grinding softly through the mud, its crew tense and silent inside the metal shell. The commander scanned the tree line through his periscope. No movement, only the faint hum of insects and the slow rumble of the engine. Then a flash, a streak of fire, like lightning born from the earth itself. It struck the Panzer's side with a hiss, followed by a blast that ripped through armor as if it were paper. Molten steel sprayed inside the turret. Screams were swallowed by the roar of the explosion. When the smoke cleared, the Panzer lay still, blackened, its armor sagging, melted from within. From the hedgerow, an American infantryman lowered a tube-shaped weapon from his shoulder, the end still smoking. In that instant, the balance of power on the battlefield shifted. The age of invincible armor had ended. The weapon that changed infantry warfare had arrived. By the early years of World War II, German armor ruled the battlefield. When the Wehrmacht unleashed its blitzkrieg across Europe in 1939 and 1940, the world witnessed a new kind of warfare. Speed, precision, and steel combined into a weapon of unstoppable momentum. Panzer divisions carved through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with ruthless efficiency. Entire armies crumbled before them. Tanks were no longer slow-moving beasts of the First World War. They were hunters now, swift, coordinated, and devastating. Infantry without adequate anti-tank defenses were little more than prey. A platoon's courage meant nothing when faced with the grinding approach of a Panzer's treads and the deafening roar of its 75mm gun. For the Allies, it was a nightmare realized. In 1940, during the fall of France, entire defensive lines collapsed as French and British troops watched their anti-tank rifles bounce harmlessly off German armor. The boys' anti-tank rifle, once thought effective, barely scratched the paint of a Panzer III. Even the 37mm door-knocker guns fielded by the British were outmatched by the thicker, sloped armor of the German machines. The message was clear. The tank was king. And kings were difficult to dethrone. As the war expanded to North Africa and the Eastern Front, the problem only deepened. German engineers continued to improve their designs, from the Panzer IV to the Panther, and finally to the massive Tiger. With each upgrade, their armor grew thicker, their guns deadlier. On the vast plains of Russia and the deserts of Libya, German crews felt nearly invincible inside their steel beasts. For Allied infantry, that invincibility was a source of terror. Reports from North Africa described soldiers abandoning positions at the sound of approaching treads, knowing that rifles and grenades were useless. Field artillery could stop tanks, but it was heavy, immobile, and often destroyed before it could fire. Infantry needed something else, something portable. Something personal. The idea wasn't new. As early as the First World War, militaries had experimented with hand-thrown shaped charge grenades and cumbersome anti-tank rifles. But they were unreliable, dangerous to the user, and required suicidal proximity to the target. A man had to get within a few meters of a tank to have any chance at all. And often, he never got that close. By 1942, this imbalance had become a strategic concern for the United States Army. The tank had evolved faster than the soldier. The infantryman, once the core of every army, had become vulnerable, dependent on artillery or air power to survive against armor. Commanders in Washington knew that had to change. Behind the front lines, scientists and engineers began to ask a daring question. Could one man, on foot, destroy a tank? It was a radical notion at the time. A tank was tens of tons of hardened steel, built to withstand everything but another tank. Yet, in laboratories and proving grounds across America, researchers were uncovering a strange and powerful phenomenon: the shaped charge. Unlike conventional explosives that relied on brute force, the shaped charge focused its energy into a single point. When detonated, it created a narrow jet of molten metal capable of piercing armor many times thicker than the explosive's own diameter. It didn't need speed or mass, just physics. The problem was how to deliver it. Throwing it was too dangerous. Firing it from a gun required recoil systems too heavy for a man to carry. What they needed was a way to launch the shaped charge safely, accurately, and from a distance. At the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, a young engineer named Edward G. Uhl worked with rocket pioneer Dr. Robert H. Goddard's principles to build exactly that: a small, shoulder-fired rocket launcher. The early prototypes looked crude: a simple metal tube with a trigger grip and wires leading to a battery. But when tested, the results stunned observers. A rocket-propelled grenade, no bigger than a man's arm, punched through tank armor like butter. For the first time, a single infantryman could wield the power to stop a machine that had defined the war. But would it work in battle? Would it survive the mud, fear, and chaos of real combat? The weapon was still experimental. Soldiers joked about it, engineers doubted it, and generals hesitated to trust it. Yet in the deserts of North Africa, the first field tests would soon silence every doubt. The American engineers called it the M1 rocket launcher. Soldiers, however, found another name, one that would echo through the war: the bazooka. Its nickname came from a comical brass musical instrument built by radio entertainer Bob Burns, a makeshift trombone that looked uncannily like the new launcher. When troops saw the resemblance, the name stuck instantly. But behind the humor was a serious weapon, the most revolutionary piece of infantry technology since the machine gun. The M1 bazooka was deceptively simple: a 54-inch steel tube, open at both ends, weighing just under 15 pounds. A soldier rested it on his shoulder, loaded a rocket from the rear, and connected two wires from the rocket's tail to the weapon's firing circuit. When he squeezed the trigger, a small battery sent a jolt of electricity that ignited the rocket's propellant. The projectile shot forward, leaving behind a fiery exhaust trail and a whistling sound that struck fear into tank crews who heard it too late. Its heart was the M6 rocket, tipped with a shaped charge warhead capable of penetrating over 75 millimeters of armor, enough to disable most German Panzers of the early war years. For the first time, the balance between man and machine seemed possible again. But technology alone was never enough in war. Weapons succeed not because of what they can do, but because of where and how they are used. The bazooka's first combat deployment came in the North African campaign of 1942. American troops of Operation Torch carried the launchers ashore, uncertain of what to expect. Against German and Italian armor, results were mixed. Dust, heat, and inexperience all took their toll. Some rockets misfired. Others failed to detonate properly. Yet, when the weapon worked, it was devastating. Reports from Tunisia told of lone infantrymen ambushing German half-tracks and light tanks at close range. At Kasserine Pass, where U.S. forces suffered a harsh defeat, isolated bazooka teams managed to destroy several enemy vehicles before being overrun. These first encounters revealed both the promise and the limitations of the new weapon. The early M1 and M1A1 models had flaws: weak batteries, poor sights, and limited range. The rockets lost accuracy beyond 100 yards, forcing soldiers to get dangerously close to enemy armor. Still, for men who once had nothing but rifles and grenades, the bazooka was a symbol of hope and defiance. As American production surged, so did refinement. The improved M9 version, introduced in 1943, featured better electrical firing systems and a collapsible tube for easier transport. Engineers refined the warhead, improving penetration to over 100 millimeters. The weapon became lighter, more reliable, and deadlier. Meanwhile, German military intelligence took notice. Captured bazookas from North Africa were sent to Berlin for study. What they discovered alarmed them. The weapon's simplicity made it easy to replicate. And within months, German engineers produced their own larger version. The Panzer, or Tank Terror. It was heavier, more powerful, and shielded against backblast. But its lineage was unmistakable. The Americans had unknowingly inspired their own counter. By the time Allied forces landed in Italy in 1943, the bazooka had become a standard issue for assault teams. Soldiers used it to destroy bunkers, machine gun nests, and even fortified walls. It was no longer just an anti-tank weapon. It was a universal equalizer, compact, versatile, and terrifying in close combat. But its true proving ground awaited in northern France. When Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the German armored divisions were waiting. Panthers, Tigers, and self-propelled guns concealed among hedgerows and villages. The battlefield was a maze of ambushes and counterattacks. Here, the bazooka's story reached its defining moment. For the first time, infantrymen faced tanks at near point-blank range in the thick bocage country, where every hedgerow could hide a gunner, and every field was a killing ground. Veteran tankers who had once rolled across Europe without fear began to realize that their armor, once a fortress, could now become a trap. The era of the unstoppable tank was over. The balance of power between man and machine was about to change forever. For the soldiers who carried it, the bazooka was more than a weapon. It was deliverance. Before its arrival, infantrymen often described facing tanks as a form of helplessness. Veterans from North Africa remembered the metallic growl of a Panzer as something almost alive, an approaching doom that no courage could stop. Men fired rifles in vain, knowing it would do nothing but announce their position. Then came the bazooka. For the first time, one man could level the odds. Holding that tubular launcher, resting its weight on his shoulder, he carried something no rifleman in history had possessed: the ability to destroy a tank alone. It changed morale instantly. Reports from frontline units spoke of newfound confidence. Soldiers trained relentlessly, learning how to move through cover, to wait for the perfect angle, to fire only when the target's flank was exposed. The bazooka didn't just kill tanks, it gave the infantry its courage back. But courage came at a cost. Operating a bazooka required calm under fire. The weapon's backblast revealed the shooter's position instantly, and the slow reload left him vulnerable. In the chaos of Normandy's hedgerows, many gunners didn't get a second shot. The weapon demanded nerve, and it rewarded precision. Still, to the men who had once been powerless against steel giants, it represented something profound: control, the power to fight back. Behind the bazooka's terrifying effectiveness was one of the most fascinating discoveries in wartime physics: the Monroe effect. Named after American scientist Charles E. Monroe, it described how shaping an explosive charge into a hollow cone could focus its energy into a narrow jet of molten metal. When detonated against armor, that jet moved at over 7,000 meters per second, fast enough to burn through inches of hardened steel. The result wasn't melting in the cinematic sense, but to tank crews inside, that's exactly what it looked and felt like. When a shaped charge struck, it sent a jet of superheated copper through the armor, spraying fragments, fire, and pressure inside the vehicle. Crewmen often described it as if the steel walls themselves had turned liquid. To the German tankers of 1944, this was unimaginable. Their Panzers had survived artillery barrages and air attacks, yet this small handheld launcher punched through from 100 yards away. For them, the sensation was shocking: instantaneous defeat from an invisible assailant. The simplicity of the bazooka's design masked the brilliance of its science. There was no recoil system, No complex optics, no heavy carriage, just raw, applied physics. It embodied the wartime American philosophy: efficiency through simplicity. And yet, that simplicity made it universally adaptable. From the jungles of the Pacific to the hedgerows of France, it could be carried, maintained, and repaired anywhere. The weapon was not just powerful, it was practical. Before 1943, infantry doctrine revolved around the idea that tanks required other tanks to stop them. Armies organized anti-tank companies with towed guns, cumbersome and exposed. Infantry units depended on those guns for survival, which meant if the guns fell behind, so did the defense. The bazooka shattered that dependency. Suddenly, every small unit could defend itself against armor. Patrols could move independently, ambushes could be set without heavy equipment, and defense became mobile. In Normandy, these tactical shifts became crucial. The thick hedgerows created a labyrinth of narrow fields and hidden lanes where tanks could advance only in single file. American infantry used this to their advantage, setting ambushes at corners, waiting for tanks to expose their flanks, and firing at close range. A two-man team, gunner and loader, became the tank's worst nightmare. They moved silently through the undergrowth, found position, fired, and vanished. What once required artillery batteries could now be done by two men with a rocket tube and nerves of steel. Tanks, once the symbol of dominance, now required constant infantry support. Every hedgerow might hide a bazooka team. Every ruined house could conceal a death sentence. This shift redefined how both sides fought. German commanders began ordering infantry screens ahead of their tanks, slowing their attacks and reducing mobility. The psychological impact was enormous. Armor no longer guaranteed safety. It invited risk. In tactical manuals written after 1944, one phrase appeared repeatedly: infantry armed with rockets can stop armor anywhere. The tank's reign as the unchallenged master of the battlefield was ending, not through overwhelming firepower, but through ingenuity, nerve, and human adaptability. Innovation in wartime is rarely smooth. When the bazooka first appeared in American ordnance reports, it was met not with excitement, but skepticism. Many senior officers saw it as a novelty. Generals raised concerns about its reliability, range, and the psychological risk of handing rocket launchers to every infantryman. The U.S. Army, in 1942, was still conservative in its approach to weapons development. Artillery and armor were viewed as the decisive tools of modern war. Infantry was expected to support them, not challenge their role. The idea that one man could destroy a tank contradicted decades of doctrine. Yet, a few visionaries saw the potential. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, then leading the Allied campaign in North Africa, pressed for field trials despite early failures. General George S. Patton, though initially doubtful, became one of its fiercest advocates after seeing it in action during the Sicilian campaign. In one of his reports to headquarters, Patton famously noted, "The infantry now has its own artillery." It was a revolution in thinking, a redistribution of battlefield power. Once generals realized that a lightweight weapon could alter the rhythm of ground combat, they began integrating bazooka teams into every platoon. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Training centers across England and the U.S. began drilling men in tank hunting tactics. Still, leadership was not blind to its weaknesses. Officers warned that soldiers could grow overconfident, mistaking the bazooka for an invincible weapon. Field experience showed otherwise. The weapon required discipline, accurate aim, proper range, and precise shot placement. A missed shot often meant death, but it was precisely this discipline, taught, learned, and refined, that turned the bazooka from a novelty into a doctrine. By the 19th, every Allied commander understood. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was a new philosophy of warfare. For German tank crews, the first encounters with the bazooka were terrifying. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with a belief in technological supremacy. Their panzers had triumphed across Europe, brushing aside resistance. Even in the deserts of North Africa, German armor had earned a mythic reputation. Fast, precise, and seemingly indestructible. Then came Normandy. Reports began filtering back to headquarters from the front lines. Tanks struck by unknown handheld weapons, armor punctured, turrets destroyed from angles previously considered safe. At first, German officers suspected British Piats, another anti-tank weapon. But captured American launchers soon told the truth. These new rocket tubes were simple, cheap, and horrifyingly effective. In late 1943, the Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office, began work on their own version. Engineers scaled it up, increased the warhead size, and added a protective blast shield to protect the shooter from exhaust flames. The result was the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, better known as the Panzerschreck. Literally, tank terror. It fired an 80mm rocket capable of penetrating over 150 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy even the heaviest Allied tanks. It was heavier than the bazooka, but devastatingly powerful. German infantry platoons on the eastern and western fronts began carrying them in growing numbers. By 1944, both sides had mirrored weapons, the American bazooka and the German Panzerschreck, reflections of the same fear. The irony was striking. A weapon born from American ingenuity now fueled the very terror it was meant to end. In combat reports from the Eastern Front, Soviet tankers described the same dread once felt by Allied infantry, advancing cautiously, scanning tree lines for the faint glint of a launch tube. No longer did the tank symbolize invincibility. It symbolized exposure. This symmetry defined late-war combat, each side's soldiers hiding, waiting, daring the other to reveal movement. War had become intimate again. Not machine versus machine, but man versus man, each armed with the power to destroy the other's most prized weapon. Perhaps the greatest transformation brought by the bazooka wasn't technological, but psychological. It changed how soldiers felt about war, about fear, courage, and power. Before its arrival, tank warfare carried a brutal hierarchy. Inside a panzer, men felt untouchable. Outside, infantry felt disposable. A few inches of steel determined life or death. The bazooka erased that line. It gave the powerless the means to strike back. For the Allies, it restored faith in human ingenuity. For the Germans, it shattered the myth of mechanical dominance. Tank crews began to describe the sensation of paranoia, scanning every building, every bush, every hedgerow. Even when none were present, they imagined them. The sound of a rocket launch became one of the most dreaded noises of the war. Psychologists studying post-war interviews with tank veterans noticed a shift in language. Before 1944, they spoke of charging and pushing through. After Normandy, they spoke of surviving. The bazooka didn't just pierce armor, it pierced the illusion of control. Morally, the weapon represented a strange paradox. It democratized destruction. For the first time in modern warfare, a single soldier carried the power once reserved for artillery. It blurred the boundary between human effort and machine supremacy. In this way, the bazooka foreshadowed the age of the guided missile. Small, precise, devastating, and deeply personal. Yet there was an undeniable dignity in its story. Unlike the weapons of mass destruction that would soon follow, the bazooka still required courage. A man had to expose himself, stand his ground, and aim. The act demanded both intellect and nerve. It symbolized the enduring balance between technology and bravery, the two forces that defined the 20th century's wars. Normandy, June 1944. The hedgerows of northern France were supposed to be peaceful farmland. Now they had become one of the deadliest landscapes of the war. Thick walls of tangled roots and earthen embankments cut the countryside into a maze of narrow fields. Every lane, every orchard, every ditch could hide an ambush. For the German defenders, this terrain was ideal. Panthers and Panzer IVs could wait motionless behind hedgerows, engines off, their long guns aimed down narrow lanes. The moment an Allied column appeared, they fired with brutal precision. Tanks and half-tracks burned. Infantry scattered, but the Americans adapted quickly. Within days of the D-Day landings, the bazooka became their most important equalizer. Infantry squads began operating in small, self-contained tank hunting teams, 2 men with a bazooka, 2 with rifles, 1 with a radio. They moved like shadows, crawling through mud and nettles, listening for the distinct clatter of treads. Every step brought them closer to a machine that could end their lives with a single shell. One U.S. report from the 2nd Armored Division described how a bazooka team near St. Lo took position behind a hedgerow at dawn. A German Panzer IV rolled into the field, its commander standing half-exposed in the cupola, scanning the mist for movement. The gunner waited, heart pounding, until the tank's flank turned slightly toward him. He aimed, fired, and in less than a second the rocket struck. The explosion tore through the side plate, igniting fuel and ammunition. The commander never even ducked. The blast threw him from the turret as the tank erupted in fire. That scene played out hundreds of times in Normandy. The Germans had entered France believing their armor superiority would once again dictate the battle's tempo. Instead, they found themselves fighting an invisible enemy, unseen until it was too late. The bazooka's impact wasn't measured just in destroyed tanks, but in how it changed movement. German crews began refusing to advance without infantry screens. They drove slower, scanning for telltale launch tubes. Every delay cost them momentum, and in blitzkrieg doctrine, loss of momentum was death. At Carentan, a German armored thrust met fierce resistance from American paratroopers armed with bazookas. Outnumbered and outgunned, the paratroopers held the town by turning its narrow streets into traps. They fired from doorways, from upper-floor windows, from behind rubble. Each rocket flash brought the echo of German panic, the grinding reverse of gears, the sudden retreat of steel that no longer felt immortal. And in the bocage, where visibility was measured in meters, every tank advance became a gamble. One wrong turn could end with a burning hulk and a dead crew. Commanders in the field began noting the psychological shift. In one after-action report, a U.S. officer wrote, "Our men no longer fear tanks. They hunt them." That single sentence captured a revolution that statistics alone could not describe. The Germans, too, recorded their shock. In a Panzer battalion log from July 1944, a captain lamented, "Our armor advantage is lost. The enemy's rockets strike like lightning from nowhere." The once terrifying thunder of approaching panzers now carried a different sound in the American ranks. An opportunity. Infantry, who had once fled, now stood their ground, waiting for the right moment, the right angle. The turning point came not from a single battle, but from countless small victories. Ambushes fought in silence, sudden flashes of fire, and the chilling aftermath of melted steel. Each encounter told the same story. The battlefield had changed forever. By July, entire German armored formations were being delayed by small pockets of bazooka-armed infantry. The weapon that had been doubted, mocked, and tested under skepticism had become the cornerstone of Allied ground combat. The German generals knew it. Reports reached the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, describing the weapon's growing toll. In desperation, orders were issued to thicken side armor, add protective skirts, and coordinate more infantry screens. But nothing could erase the fear that now haunted every tank commander in Normandy. The bazooka had proven more than its worth. It had redefined the battlefield dynamic. Speed was no longer advantage, armor was no longer safety, and the tank was no longer untouchable. But as the Allies pushed deeper into France, the war's momentum carried this duel to its next level. When the Germans would strike back with their own rocket terror, and Europe's fields would erupt in a new arms race of man-portable firepower. By late 1944, the thunder of tanks across Europe had changed tone, no longer the unstoppable iron avalanche that rolled through France in 1940. Now it was the cautious advance of machines aware they could die. The weapon that once gave Germany its dominance had met its counterstroke, but the Germans were not the kind to surrender an advantage easily. Reports from the front flooded the Wehrmacht's high command. Allied infantry were destroying tanks at close range, often from ambush, using American rocket tubes. Engineers at Mauser and Rheinmetall were ordered to study captured bazookas. Within weeks, German workshops began producing something far more lethal: the Panzer, literally tank terror. It was heavier, bulkier, and far more destructive. Instead of a 2.36-inch rocket, it fired a 3.5-inch warhead capable of punching through over 200 millimeters of armor, enough to obliterate even the thick frontal plates of Allied Shermans. When fired, it belched flame and smoke, its recoilless blast echoing through the ruins of villages and forests. The German soldier who shouldered it was transformed into a tank killer. Satanti Chudiran, infantrymen with the power to shatter steel beasts at will. On the Eastern Front, Red Army tank crews began calling it the Devil's Flute. On the Western Front, GIs simply called it the German Bazooka. At first, the Allies laughed when they saw it, a crude, oversized copy of their own design. But laughter turned to fear when the first Panzer teams began hunting Sherman columns in the Ardennes. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, entire American armored convoys were ambushed by small squads armed only with these rocket launchers. In the misty forests near Bastogne, U.S. tankers reported seeing flashes of light streak from the trees, followed by explosions that tore through armor as if it were paper. The Panzer had arrived like a whisper of vengeance, and with it, the battlefield entered a terrifying equilibrium, where both sides now wielded the power to destroy armor at will. The turning point was psychological as much as tactical. For years, tanks had embodied invincibility, a symbol of mechanized superiority, of control over the battlefield. Infantry were their shield and sword bearers, never their equals. But now, the balance had flipped. One man, one tube, one shot. That was all it took to erase a $100,000 war machine. This new reality forced armies to evolve overnight. The doctrines written in the age of Blitzkrieg no longer worked. Speed and surprise meant nothing if a lone soldier in a ditch could end an armored column's advance. Infantry began dispersing further apart. Tanks moved only with covering fire. Commanders rewrote tactics on the march. Engineers developed countermeasures: wire mesh skirts, improvised armor, explosive side plates. Desperate attempts to shield against the invisible threat. But it wasn't just a war of metal anymore. It was a war of nerves. Tank crews began living in fear of shadows. Every window, every tree line, every pile of rubble might hide a rocket tube. Soldiers spoke of nightmares, of seeing fiery trails racing toward them in their sleep. In one recorded account, a German gunner described the effect: "We no longer fight soldiers, we fight ghosts. They wait until we cannot see them, and then our world turns white." That was the power of the Panzer, not just destruction, but terror. It leveled the hierarchy of war. The might of industry and the courage of the individual were suddenly equal, and perhaps That was the most dangerous shift of all, because when a single man could kill a tank, the very definition of power changed. In the ruins of Caen, Allied engineers examined captured German launchers and were stunned. The Panzer Schreck's range, accuracy, and penetration were far beyond the original bazooka. Within months, the Allies responded with an upgraded 3.5-inch Super Bazooka, a design that would live on for decades. From Normandy to the Ardennes, from Warsaw to Berlin, the dueling shadows of these two weapons marked a new age. It was no longer the war of tanks versus tanks. It was now the age of man versus machine. The rocket launcher had made the individual soldier powerful again. Dangerously so. By 1945, as Berlin burned, both weapons had become symbols of a brutal truth. Technology had equalized death. A farmer's son with a steel tube could now decide the fate of a tank division. And when the smoke of Europe finally cleared, the world's armies would never forget this lesson. Every nation, from the United States to the Soviet Union, raced to refine the idea, to build better, faster, deadlier versions. The arms race that would define the Cold War had already begun. Born from the mud and hedgerows of Normandy, and from the terror-filled forests of the Ardennes. It was no longer about who built the biggest machine. It was about who could kill it first. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay in ruin, nations bled dry, and the smoke of total war drifted like a veil over the future. Amid the wreckage, armies gathered their surviving weapons, not just to count them, but to learn from them. And among all the lessons of that brutal conflict, one truth stood out clearly. The tank, once the king of the battlefield, had been dethroned. For 3 decades, military doctrine across the world had revolved around one idea: armored supremacy. From the deserts of North Africa to the snowfields of Russia, tanks had symbolized both strength and fear. They were the spearhead of every offensive, the unstoppable machines that crushed empires, but the bazooka, and later the Panzer Schreck, had shattered that illusion. In American after-action reports, one chilling statistic emerged. Small infantry squads equipped with rocket launchers had destroyed hundreds of German tanks during the push from Normandy to the Rhine. These weren't elite units or special forces. They were ordinary soldiers, often farmers, mechanics, or factory hands, carrying a weapon light enough to shoulder yet powerful enough to burn through armor. This was a revolution. The battlefield had been democratized. No longer was victory dictated purely by industrial output or mechanical dominance. A single soldier's courage, timing, and precision could alter the course of a battle. It was a shift the world's generals could not ignore. In the war's immediate aftermath, captured weapons were tested and studied by every major power. The Americans analyzed dozens of Panzer Schrecks, realizing just how advanced the German design truly was. Its larger caliber, magnetic sights, and rocket velocity made it superior in almost every way. Within months, U.S. engineers began developing the M20 Super Bazooka. It fired a heavier 3.5-inch warhead capable of piercing even the new generation of Soviet tanks. The message was clear. The rocket launcher was no longer an emergency weapon. It was a core element of modern infantry power. The Soviets, too, had learned. During the closing months of the war, they had fielded their own copy of the bazooka, the RPG-43, and later the RPG-2, primitive yet devastating. In the ruins of Berlin, Soviet troops had stormed entire streets, armed with little more than grenades and shoulder-fired rockets. By 1947, the term anti-tank infantry was no longer a novelty. It was a military necessity. Every modern army began organizing special rocket teams, training them not just to defend against armor, but to ambush it. The age of the tank charge, the thundering, unstoppable advance of steel, was over. Now, tanks had to move with caution, screened by infantry, drones, and reconnaissance. Every advance was a chess game between armor and its hunters. But the aftermath of the Bazooka Revolution wasn't limited to tactics. It reached deep into psychology. Before Normandy, tank crews believed in the myth of invulnerability. The thick armor, the roar of engines, the sense of being cocooned in indestructible steel. It all created a deadly confidence. But after 1944, that confidence fractured. In interviews conducted after the war, Allied and German tankers alike described a shared fear, the haunting uncertainty that at any moment, from any hedge or window, a rocket could appear. You learned to fear silence, one American Sherman driver recalled. When the battlefield went quiet, that's when they were aiming. For infantry, too, the effect was profound. The bazooka had given them power, but also burden. They carried a weapon capable of killing from yards away, but every shot risked giving away their position. They became hunters, yes, but also hunted. In that deadly symmetry lay the future of modern warfare. Meanwhile, in the halls of military academies, theorists began rewriting the future of combat. The question was no longer, how do we build stronger tanks? But how do we protect them from men with rockets? This debate defined the post-war decades. Engineers developed sloped armor, reactive plating, and eventually composite. Armor like the British Chobham, all attempts to outsmart the shaped charge that the bazooka had introduced to the world. But each layer of defense only provoked a more powerful offense, from the American law to the Soviet RPG-7. The lineage of the bazooka grew into an entire family of weapons that would dominate conflicts from Korea to Afghanistan. What began as a 15-pound steel tube carried by a nervous soldier in Normandy had evolved into a symbol of asymmetric power. The idea that even the smallest fighter could destroy the mightiest machine. It was a technological seed that grew into the modern concept of man-portable firepower. As the world divided into East and West, the lessons of the bazooka found new battlefields. In Korea, U.S. troops faced North Korean and Chinese T-34s, tanks nearly invulnerable to the old 2.36-inch launchers. Only the new Super Bazooka could match them. And in Vietnam, a generation later, Soviet-made RPGs would return the favor, turning American helicopters and armored carriers into fireballs in the jungle. The weapon born in World War II had become eternal. Its principle, a man with a tube, defying steel, was no longer just a tactical reality. It was a philosophical one. The industrial age of war had given birth to a new age, one where power no longer meant size, but precision, and in that realization lay the true aftermath of the bazooka's debut. Because after 1945, every nation knew that the balance between man and machine had changed forever, and there was no going back. In the shadow of victory, the real war began, the war for knowledge. When Allied and Soviet engineers scoured the ruins of Germany, they weren't only seeking documents or blueprints. They were chasing an idea, a weapon that could give a single soldier the destructive power once reserved for artillery. The bazooka and Panzer had proven that principle beyond doubt. Both sides, East and West, saw it as the future. By 1946, American ordnance experts were already drafting reports under a single heading: the infantry's answer to armor. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had captured entire stocks of German anti-tank rockets and immediately began testing them at proving grounds outside Moscow. Engineers under Mikhail Kalashnikov's circle were tasked with adapting the shaped charge concept into a universal rocket system. Out of that effort came the weapon that would haunt Western forces for decades, the RPG, or Rushnoi Protovotankovy Granatomyot. Its first version, the RPG-2, appeared in the early 1950s. Simple, rugged, and cheap. It followed the same principle as the bazooka, but with Soviet practicality. A steel tube, open-ended, firing a 40 mm rocket with a shaped charge warhead. The Americans improved their own designs, the M20 Super Bazooka, and later the M72 Law, light anti-tank weapon, portable, disposable, efficient. But the Soviets went one step further. The RPG-7, introduced in 1961, became the most recognizable rocket launcher in history, an echo of the bazooka's original concept, perfected for mass warfare. Every battlefield of the Cold War would prove the same truth that Normandy first revealed. Armor could no longer move without fear. In Korea, the new 3.5-inch Super Bazooka turned the tide against North Korean T-34s that had previously shrugged off smaller weapons. Infantry once again dictated the rhythm of armored combat. In Vietnam, the story reversed. Soviet-made RPG-7s, carried by Viet Cong guerrillas, struck fear into American convoys and helicopters. The jungle became a mirror of the hedgerows of Normandy, hidden soldiers waiting for a glimpse of steel before unleashing a fiery trail. American soldiers who fired. Bazookas in France would have recognized the sound. The hiss, the whoosh, the explosion that followed a half-second later. The principle hadn't changed. Only the sides had. The same weapon that had once given the Allies their strength now armed the world's insurgents. In the decades that followed, the ripple effect spread across continents. Middle Eastern armies, Asian militias, African insurgents, all studied the shaped charge. It was simple to make, devastating to use, and almost impossible to defend against without advanced materials. Tanks grew thicker, heavier, more expensive. But no matter how much steel they carried, a man in the shadows could still bring them down. By the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egyptian and Syrian infantry equipped with Soviet RPG-7s and AT-3 Sagar missiles destroyed hundreds of Israeli tanks in days. Military historians called it the revenge of the infantryman. What began as a desperate American experiment in 1942, a crude steel tube meant to stop German panzers, had evolved into a global philosophy. The weapon of the underdog, psychologically, it reshaped the identity of the modern soldier. The bazooka had transformed the infantryman's role from follower to equal, from a spectator in armored warfare to its decisive player. Soldiers no longer hid from tanks. They hunted them. This mentality, the belief that courage and cunning could overcome machines, became the soul of post-war combat. It also birthed an entirely new way of thinking about warfare, asymmetry. Where once battles were fought between equal armies, the age of the bazooka proved that imbalance could be power. Guerrilla fighters, resistance movements, and insurgent forces across the 20th century used that same principle. Mobility, precision, and the fear of what could be hiding in the next shadow. The rocket launcher became not just a weapon, but a statement that even against overwhelming force, the smallest soldier could still strike back. Militaries took the lesson into the future. By the 1980s, nations were racing to develop guided rockets, shoulder-fired missiles like the AT-4, Law-80, and the American FGM-148 Javelin, weapons that could destroy modern tanks from over 2 kilometers away. Every one of them traced its lineage, back to that moment in 1942 when an American soldier first shouldered a bazooka and changed the battlefield forever. The bazooka's DNA runs through every modern anti-tank and anti-armor system, from the American Javelin to the Russian Cornet, from Ukraine's Stugna P to the British NLOW. Its legacy is global, timeless, and still expanding, and yet, amid all the technological leaps, the emotional truth remains hauntingly the same. The same sound still echoes. The hiss, the streak of flame, the silence before impact. The same fear still grips tank crews when they move through narrow streets or forest roads. The same image, one man, one weapon, standing against a machine, still defines courage in its rawest form. 80 years after Normandy, the bazooka's ghost remains on every battlefield where armor meets infantry. It whispers the same lesson to every generation. No machine is invincible. No soldier is powerless. The balance of war, once measured in tons of steel, now lives in the heartbeat of a man holding a weapon that weighs barely 10 kilograms. And from that heartbeat came a revolution that changed not only how wars were fought, but how they were. Feared war is remembered for its machines, for the thunder of tanks, the roar of aircraft, the silhouettes of giants crawling across ruined cities. But history is changed by something smaller, something that fits on a soldier's shoulder and in his will. The bazooka was never just a weapon. It was a statement that no empire, no engine, no armor could ever be truly safe from the hands of the ordinary man. In 1944, when that first streak of fire melted through German steel, it didn't just pierce a tank. It pierced an idea, the illusion of invincibility. For the first time in modern history, the weakest could destroy the strongest. Power itself had shifted, from factories and foundries to foxholes and trenches. Every war since has lived in that shadow. From Korea to Vietnam, from Iraq to Ukraine, the shaped charge born from the bazooka still dictates the rhythm of battle. It still forces tanks to move cautiously, convoys to hide, and commanders to fear what they cannot see. The world's mightiest machines still fear the same thing: a single human being, waiting, unseen, steadying his aim. In that equation, man against metal, lies the eternal paradox of warfare. The more we advance, the more power returns to the individual. The more we build, the more we realize how fragile power truly is. The bazooka didn't just change weapons, it changed psychology. It changed courage. It changed fear. And though its smoke has long faded from the fields of Normandy, its echo still travels across every modern battlefield. A whisper in the wind, a reminder that the future of war will never belong entirely to machines. Because somewhere, hidden in the dust and silence, there will always be someone. One soldier, one moment, one shot, proving again that no armor is eternal, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting legacy of all.